By good points, I mean like nitpicks that aren't wrong, but also like, I wonder how many people were legitimately bothered before I pointed out as being dumb? Like yeah, the Celestial Spirit time crunch gets really weird the moment you take it away from the joke it's in service of. Sure, I was bothered then because I wanted Fairy Tail to be more consistent, but I also wasn't paying enough attention in the first place and reading bad translations, so my understanding was limited as it was. Not that Majima didn't make mistakes, he was upfront about a lot of them in the question and answer corner. Nowadays, when I think about this moment, on one hand the series would be worse for trying to roll with and explore this new setting detail, but on the other hand I do like the joke conceptually, so there's that. What else? Natsu being able to just make a fire hand is dumb, sure, let's go with that. Not even really because he can do it out of nowhere, but because such an ability that could be used and iterated on is never brought up again. In comparison, after Tartaros, Natsu has achieved a finesse with his powers that he can burn things selectively, like clothes or even magic, which is neat, and while it is another example of Natsu changing the properties of his fire, Solid Fire would have been a neat skill in his toolbox, though it also might have risked making his powers a bit closer to Gajeel or Gray's, so it's probably better off not being explored again anyway. Yeah, I got nothing else. World building is kind of fucking overused, isn't it? Like, I enjoy me some world building, don't get me wrong. But what I don't enjoy is the idea of art essentialism. The idea that all art must qualify some kind of rule or standard to be called worthwhile. That's pretty shallow if you ask me. I highly recommend giving the linked articles on world building a read, as my mindset in the video is one evocative of the same narrow idea the articles respond to. That all settings must have some kind of arbitrary set of rules and realistic logic that must be consistent at all times, even though no story is actually realistic. A lot of faults in the video are either misunderstandings, possibly due to mistranslation, misreadings that ignore the literary context for the mechanic in question or just lacked it, and overall, extrapolating what's there in the setting under misguided realism that would crumple the makeup of literally any fictional story. Take some of Natsu's power-ups for example. Laxus passing off his lightning was a symbolic gesture. Hades had to be defeated by Fairy Tail unified, but Laxus had been cast out of the guild, so by passing along his lightning, he's able to recognize his peers in the next generation that understood the ideals of the guild better than he had who he'd rejected before, contributing to Hades' defeat even as an outsider, starting his path to rejoin the guild as a proper member. So when I argued that Dragon Slayers should have passed their magic around to each other, I disregarded that Natsu had to figure out how to even use both after the fact anyway, meaning it's not as easy as I pretended it was, while also conveniently not mentioning how if all the characters in the story had the same power, that's kind of fucking boring? I also claim that Natsu eating Etherion doesn't have any meaningful weaknesses, but looking back, I don't see why it needs one considering the impact it does offer in service of the narrative. Given that the arc happens to deal on the theme of sacrifice, Natsu is willing to risk his body to stop Jalal and save Urza through eating Etherion, but takes no action that would offer up his life. Contrast this with Urza, whose funeral scene is one that makes her face her choice to give herself to save others, seeing the pain her sacrifice would cause to those around her. Through her survival, she turned away from that self-sacrificing nature, understanding the importance of life. Later, Jalal wondered if dying to atone would allow him to be able to earn forgiveness from those he'd wronged, but Urza said he should atone by living, having seen the side he was considering. Natsu may have risked himself through Etherion, but death was something he didn't plan to get close to. The fact that he was able to risk himself to make up for his lack of power without putting his life on the line both contrasts Urza and offers something, just not the specific and arbitrary thing I was looking for at the time. Then, in an arc about trust, Brain and Zero betraying Oliver Raytheon Sace for their goals, Natsu earned Jalal's trust through his actions in the Tower of Heaven and got the Gold Flame, pushed by the hopes of his friends behind him. Natsu's ideals were able to allow him to work with a former enemy, while Zero cut off anyone who might have been on his side. I also shit on Natsu's fire eating not being helpful to dragon slaying and point out how Dragon Slayer magic just arbitrarily hurts more against dragons. The first one is dumb and obviously wrong because Dragon Slayers counter their element by being immune to it. Obviously, and this was well shown when Natsu fought against Atlas Flame. The real important bit of context as to why it's effective against dragons also ties into why humanity had to be taught by dragons, past me wondering why dragons knew or would teach magic best at exterminating themselves. Well, that was because there was a war going on, but I digress. The actual reason Dragon Slayer magic is specifically effective against dragons is as reference to Eastern myth, where the best thing to fight a dragon with is, well, another dragon. You might know about the tiger and dragon, but that analogy is meant to describe the tiger who challenges the powerful dragon to maintain balance, to keep the dragon from growing weak and stagnant by having that threat from below. But if they aren't stagnant, then the tiger cannot win, and the dragon must be defeated by another dragon. You can see the same idea in other Japanese media such as Monster Hunter, many of the elder dragons being weak to dragon element weapons, or in World, the Elder Seal effect that only dragon element weapons possess. A more commonly well-known example is Pokemon, where dragon is one of the only types in the game weak to itself. Fairy Tail dragons being vulnerable to magic evoking the power of dragons, even if wielded by humans, is clearly in reference to this idea, my original point being made out of cultural ignorance rather than insight. To move away from strengths, I also discussed weaknesses, the motion sickness, claiming it never comes up when it keeps 3 Dragon Slayers out of the running in one of the Grand Magic games, and still feeds into Sting's overall conflict and builds Natsu to being beyond him as a Dragon Slayer. But far more importantly, Acnologia is shaken off the Christina through the weakness, and his dragon body is lured onto a ship so the fairy sphere can work against him. Acnologia is in no small part beaten by this rule that was set up at the start of the series. Even if the chapter with Acnologia being sealed away hadn't happened in the story yet, the video coming out on July 13th while the chapter was published on July 12th, which was during the video's production, this wasn't something I accounted for in the Lies video, and it's ludicrous to say it never comes up. And even more so to say that no weaknesses are overcome in Fairy Tail when Lucy, Urza, Wendy, and Gray's character arcs are all about overcoming their personal weaknesses. Natsu has other things going on as mentioned in the first video, but Wendy's growth is the most overt thing, holy shit. And yet, as wrong as I am, even holding Fairy Tail to the standard of needing positive change to surmount weaknesses is fundamentally wrong. This demand of characters changing feeds into the mindset I aim to argue against in my character development video, where I highlight static and negative arcs as perfectly valid methods of storytelling. Natsu in particular is full of static arcs, often expressing the point of the conflict while beating down villains who don't understand or reject it. Then we get to one of my least favorite points in the video, where I joke about celestial spirit magic being great because spirits can do anything in place of their master. I can't believe I missed the entire point of Lucy's character so deeply and utterly. Well, I mean I can, actually. So, looking at my recent video on Lucy, it clearly shows how badly I was missing the point. My mindset was evocative of Lucy's at the start of the story, in which she used her spirits in place of her own strength. It's also a mindset we see in Angel, who outright uses them as tools without caring about their emotions as fellow beings. Lucy grows by taking hold of her own strength, and she gains the trust of her spirits by protecting them and thinking of their sake. Forest Gate closure was to keep Taurus from acting under mind control, and indicative of her arc in not relying on spirits by showing she can divorce herself from them. Past me wondered what made Lucy so special, while present me is fully aware that it was clearly her persistence and growth that allowed her to do exceptional things. That said, going back to the speculative fanfiction side, the old video has a very cringe and very yikes moment when I go, hey, why isn't this manga more fascist? While pointing out that mages have a lot of power, I insinuate that maybe they should just take over and stuff, no big deal. Except that's literally what Hades wanted to do by removing all non-magic users. Elfman directly rejecting Rusty Rose's suggestion by claiming mages are there to help non-magic users, not rule over them. Never mind that I clearly missed a lot. While the council does have power at the end of the day, they are beholden to the nation. I criticize them for using Etherion without consequence, neglecting that after the Tower of Heaven, the council was more heavily restricted after the fallout of the Ark, needing more votes to use Etherion. And the fact that Jalal was able to exploit them and use it led to the council being broken up in the first place by their hysteria and failure to properly exercise the authority they'd been given. Jalal in general was an existing flaw in their system, and due to his actions, the supposedly incredible Magic Council was further restricted by the powers they were actually beholden to. I noted how the Elder's confusion that Sieg was part of the council was silly, because he must have been made part of the council in the same way, yet Sieg, in the panel I showed on screen, contradicted my own words, explaining that he got his position due to his magical power, something also the case for Ultir. And only seeing the power of a mage rather than their person, something also evident in the mindset of Hades, who saw no reason non-mages should even exist, they allowed a rogue agent into their system who endangered the continent through the supposed revival of Zareth. So anyway, we need to talk about one of my biggest misreadings. Yeah, everyone in Earthland can potentially use magic, as mentioned directly in the manga. Most people just don't learn it. Edelosian people don't have magical cores, but we never see evidence for that being true of anyone in Earthland unless they're from Adolis. So equating the two is deceptive and misleading. The battle against the mercenaries was used for my argument about how people who don't use magic aren't capable, even though the point of the fight was that Natsu has physical capabilities beyond just using his magic, while the mercenaries could only rely on being physically stronger than mages or using their own power against them. Their styles suited only to defeating mages who relied on their own magic, standing zero chance against Natsu, who is both physically adept and immune to his own magic. And the claims I made fly completely in the face of the treasure hunters who give the guild pause with just their magical items, displaying no magic of their own. And that's notwithstanding Adolis as a whole. Mysticon going up against Laxus, where Nightwalker, despite having no magic capability, fought Urza and left her on the ground, one of only 2 characters to do so in the entire story after Jose. But even if normal people weren't capable of using magic, they can still create magic weapons. Something I dismiss even if those of Adolis could make magic items without being able to use magic themselves, those of Earthland should have no trouble doing the same thing, meaning they aren't beholden to those magic users. And that is an important factor in the final point of my video, in which I force this harmful point about how hard work above all is necessary. Here I show Zushi as an example while ignoring that Gon is immensely talented and outstripped him easily. I use Goku as an example because he does train regularly, but training alone isn't a good read on power, and what separates Goku from the hardest worker in Dragon Ball, Vegeta, is actually pretty important in regards to the message it wants to send, as Goku trains himself to improve for the sake of bettering himself, while Vegeta seeks the pride and superiority in being the strongest. And that's ignoring the characters in Fairy Tail that do put in the work. Lucy's whole arc is about her growing to be stronger. Gray was taught by and spends the series gradually trying to move past the trauma of the losses he's had in his life. Natsu was taught by Igneel and drives himself to improve so he can be the strongest in the guild. A few power-ups being granted in some way doesn't negate that, especially when the purpose behind them isn't being respected, as mentioned before. Ignoring offered meanings all to feed a faulty point about hard work and continue to force that dangerous narrative is just wrong-headed and misguided in every way, missing so much and leaving a video that says nothing. Yeah, Fairy Tail does have plenty of mistakes, but at the same time, endlessly delving into the logic of a story while arbitrarily discarding verisimilitude will always find logical failings and gaps in realism. So finding the line between issues with plot that really matter, and those that are just the natural constructions of a story that inherently has something to say, is something I don't see commonly enough. Fairy Tail doesn't focus on exploring the lives of non-magic users in the setting, because that's not what's interesting. Stories can transport people to a place of fantasy, where the exceptional becomes the center of things. Mages are the most interesting part of Fairy Tail, so that's what we bear witness to. Even if mistakes are better to be avoided, Mashima was made well aware of his faults as evidenced through the question corners added in the volumes, and thus far in Eden Zero he learned from those failures and aims to write a story with a better mixture of planning and freedom, thus far creating something without the various issues evident in Fairy Tail. Even putting aside the intense amounts of bad faith and wondering why the goofy wizard manga needs more fascism actually, mountains were made out of molehills, though more often than not, just made up, the point of the story well and far away ignored to force it to be something it's not. Even though, yes, I love stories that explore their setting, or mechanics, and Fairy Tail really isn't that. I may like it less, but that shouldn't limit my ability to meet Fairy Tail on its own terms, and examine all of what it's doing without asking it to do something else that it's not, when the pieces there are already in service of something meaningful. A few minor mistakes isn't the end of the world. That which accomplishes something more can't be unfairly dismissed as not being the story I wanted to be, which does not make for good critique or analysis. There's nothing wrong with self-insert fantasy in the first place, Fairy Tail isn't one, and in trying to connect a false idea of what I think it should accomplish, I ignore the ways it has and does actually connect with people. So the point about Moe not being good if cuteness is the only draw remains a fair point, just not a good one for discussing Fairy Tail for reasons I'll come to. Giving Riesli the ability to make herself thin even though her size is given so much attention is something I don't really get though, aside from being a joke I don't find particularly funny. I also still think there is the occasional issue with sexuality that I think one can definitely argue isn't necessarily appropriate in the moment. The scene of Flare crying coming to mind as one that could have been framed so as to not have her chest so front and center. However, one of the few emotional instances from the tirade I still agree with is Urza's torture at the hands of Kyoka, though there are still aspects I wasn't giving due credit, and upon further reflection I think there's more to consider here, in that my personal dislike stems from deliberate choices made to get that reaction, as I'll explain. One general consistency and contrast between Urza and Lucy is in their sexuality. Relatively speaking, Lucy tends to have the least control, often being harassed by friend and foe, while by and large Urza remains in control of her sexuality. Her hot outfits are hers to wear. There are some exceptions, but in Urza's case even those exceptions seem very deliberate. While Natsu has moments grabbing Lucy's breasts, the only character to do the same with Urza is Jalal, which is interesting in itself and how Urza's armor factors in. The armor is framed as a barrier between her and others, a natural defense she took to after her childhood of slavery. The Tower of Heaven arc pushes her to be able to take down this barrier. That's not always ideal. As Jalal showed, there are times where she needs barriers, but her ability to take off her armor to get emotionally closer to her friends is something that strengthens her. And that mention of Jalal is deliberate, as yes, one of the two characters to pierce through this armor and make Urza sexually vulnerable where she otherwise isn't is Jalal, a character she struggles to keep barriers up with due to their close personal history. The other character to do this is Kyoka, who did so not by finding a weak point in her armor, but by ripping it off and leaving Urza at her mercy. For a moment I want to call attention on a concept I found interesting in a video on High School of the Dead, that pedantic romantic made literally years ago. while I haven't seen High School of the Dead, and thus can't comment on the reading made in the video, which even admits it only applies for episodes under the main director rather than holistically, I still think it discusses an interesting idea in regards to readings around sexual vulnerability. Pedantic arguing that sexual vulnerability is being used in these episodes to highlight the danger these characters are in. Now, whether an individual in the audience might feel this way is another matter. Like with humor, sexuality and sexual interests are personal, and what works for one may not work for another. But that doesn't mean tendencies and tools can't be observed, explained, and commented on. As such, I bring up that idea because I believe it applies here as well. Never have I particularly liked this moment, even before when I wasn't fond of Urza as a character, less so now that I do like her. But it is exactly for that reason that my dislike is the result of something intentional. Urza is a strong character who by and large is in control of her sexuality, and in this instance, all her control and power is taken away from her. This would not be nearly as effective if Lucy was in place instead, as sexual vulnerability is normal for her where it's not in Urza's case. The off-putting framing and subject matter, I think, is a deliberate use to give the scene its intended effect. In the video I asked, who wants to see one of the most popular characters in the series in a state like this? My assumption being that a sexy body must inherently be appealing, when it's exactly that fact that adds to the emotional effect of the scene for me. No, it's not as brutal as a scene in Rave with Nagisa, but it's exactly because it's so different that it has stuck out to me much more. So no, I don't like the scene, because I like Urza and I don't want to see her in this state. And in that, I believe the scene is getting across exactly what it intends to. The follow-up and payoff for this whole incident is Urza defeating Kyoka, then dealing with the aftermath as she sat alone after the conflict. Trauma of her childhood resurfaced. Her trembling stopped as Jalal, the one she had previously helped back into the light, helped her to remember that while she has known weakness and strength, she should not let knowledge of her weakness knock her from the path of light. Jalal's words helping to calm Urza. As one who once could only live in her armor, in being able to shed it and make connections, even with one she'd had such a troublesome history with such as Jalal, in doing so she was able to live with her weakness, giving her the capability to open up to others without letting either the strength of her armor or the softness she had underneath wholly define her. While the video didn't pay much attention to Urza's character arc, the mindset exemplified throughout is far more dismissive, especially in Lucy, but also Wendy. Wendy's clear growth is completely dismissed because she happens to have this one comedic moe trait. An aspect of moe is the growth these characters go through, how they surpass some of these aspects in themselves. But moe is also about acceptance, of recognizing the flaws in people and appreciating them or even enjoying them for what they are. I could have argued that Wendy's clumsiness is at odds with compatibility, and thus not particularly fitting as a moe trait, or simply that I don't find it interesting as a flaw. But that's neither what I actually talked about, nor fair grounds for dismissing the confidence and will to fight that she gained, moving beyond just being a support role and not backing down from various foes. Rather than be honest about the subject, the video very much rests in its false narrative, one very evident when talking about Lucy, or more accurately, lying about Lucy. Lucy very much fights alongside her spirits, as early as Duke Everlue even. In her fight in Adola, she wins without using her spirits at all, recognizing their limited use and responding by fighting all on her own. The help she gets from Natsu is vastly overstated. Frogmouth had Natsu trapped, and it was Lucy's trick that helped him to escape. Natsu did not save Lucy alone, they saved each other. That's not even minding how in the last arc she saved Natsu by rewriting the Book of END, organized the ritual to trap Aknoliga's body, and in doing so paralyzed his spirit and helping Natsu to defeat him. While the relationship started with Lucy being saved, she grew stronger and changed to the point where Lucy could save him. I'd also forgotten her motive to join Fairy Tail out of a desire for family when her familial relationship was clearly strained, earlier suggesting that Lucy was supposed to be one of the strongest members of Fairy Tail when she never was, and relative weakness was never something that excludes you from Fairy Tail. Throughout the rest of the video is a series of scattered points of misunderstanding. I try to paint a narrative where all the female characters are beholden to some guy, but that trend falls apart when noting that Grandini and Carla, or even Sharia, are far more important to Wendy than Mystagon. Lucy's mother is much more important to her than her father, and on the flip side you have Gray, Ultir, and Leon having Ur's life and death as a major effect on them that you can compare with the examples I use, such as Kana and Gildarts. The given examples were hyper-focused as to fit the narrative I was espousing rather than offer any kind of fair reading, just like it's also not fair to claim 1. Gray, Urza, and Lucy are equivalent to a bunch of random side characters with less focus. 2. The awkward sexuality of the characters is unfitting, when it's clearly being used as a way for them to connect to the target audience of children and preteens. 3. That teenage awkwardness is even unusual in the first place. 4. I used the they have the same body type criticism that's also applicable to One Piece, which is funny because I like the Fairy Tail same body more than the One Piece one. I also don't think it's a particularly meaningful complaint since it ignores the universal media and cultural trends at work. And 5. During the Kagura impalement breakdown, I ignore the blurred edge around the sword, which makes it stand out more. And as it turns out, on the reread I didn't have my past issue where I failed to notice, so maybe my eyes just didn't work. Generally speaking, this video is trapped in my perspective. As I said, sexuality is something personal, but in order to properly argue one's point about anything, one must, on some level, be able to suspend their arguments from themselves and be able to explain them in a way that can be gotten across to people with different or even countering perspectives. How can I say that Gray isn't drawn sexually and only comedically? As a straight guy who doesn't find him attractive, I have less ability to pick up on that. If I don't find the hot guys to be attractive, obviously the hot girls need more attention and discussion. If I don't find much in Lucy's or Urza's characters beyond their bodies, their sexuality must be ruining them as characters. I don't like this scene, so that means it must be poorly conceived instead of actually getting across exactly what it intends to through what makes me not like it. In my bad faith reading, I picked up on what I wanted to and not what was there. In refusing to let myself see the other side, I ironically did exactly what I accused Mashima of doing in this very video, by seeing his characters primarily sexually instead of as characters. Even though I would never have a problem with sexuality normally, I argue that it's a problem here because it's all I'm seeing, though in truth, it was me who wasn't seeing what was really there. A shallow surface look, assuming the worst in something, because it happens to be something someone would assume is merely exactly what it is on the surface. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons. Offline but not, Baynort, Tengoon, Brorike, Sam Bellmeyer, Justice Man, Mohammed Hakim, Gloogle, Mr. Cynical, Flarbu, Dojo32161, thanks Nitrorad, and Brian Nesseth. And thank you for watching.